All right, so today we're going to try to unpack this whole thing with Macron and President Trump and Russia and Ukraine. We've got these two articles here, one from the Washington Post and one from BBC News. And, well, they paint a pretty intense picture, to say the least, especially with this being the third anniversary of the invasion.
Yeah, and what really strikes me is how this is impacting everyday people.
Yep.
What Macron's trying to do here on the world stage, it could have real consequences for families and homes, livelihoods, in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's like a real high-wire act, right?
Yeah.
Because on the one hand, you have Trump signaling this potential shift in U.S. policy, almost aligning more with Russia, and even blaming Ukraine for the invasion.
Exactly. And to understand the weight of that, you have to look at how different this is from previous U.S. approaches. I mean, historically, the U.S. has been a strong ally to Europe, particularly when it comes to Russian aggression. So this potential change in stance has a lot of European leaders feeling pretty uncertain, and they've depended on that support.
And then you add in those UN votes where the U.S. actually sided with Russia. They opposed the European resolution to condemn the invasion and then supported the one that was neutral.
Right, exactly. And these actions, along with, Trump's rhetoric, are just adding fuel to the fire of European anxiety. There's this growing sentiment that maybe Europe can't rely on the U.S. as much as they used to. Like, they have to start taking more responsibility for their own backyard, so to speak.
So into this whole whirlwind walks Macron. He meets with Trump at the White House and tries to salvage those transatlantic ties and push for Europe to be more involved in securing a peace deal for Ukraine.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because Trump essentially tells Europe, okay, if you want peace, you're going to have to pay for it. He suggests that Europe should bear the cost and the burden of peacekeeping.
I can imagine that didn't sit too well with some European leaders, especially with all this uncertainty around the U.S.'s reliability.
It didn't, and it leads to one of the big points of tension, this whole debate about the kind of aid being given to Ukraine. Trump says that Europe has only been giving loans while the U.S. has been giving grants. But Macron pushed back on this pretty hard. He said that Europe has actually contributed 60% of the total aid, and that includes grants.
So it's like a power struggle over who's really stepping up here. But
Yeah.
what does this actually mean for ordinary Ukrainians? Are they just pawns in this game of international politics?
Well, that's the heart of the issue, isn't it? While the leaders debate about money, it's the Ukrainian people who are actually experiencing this conflict. Their homes, their families, their lives are caught in the crosshairs.
And that makes Macron's efforts even more crucial. He's proposed this European peacekeeping force for Ukraine, something that Russia initially rejected outright. But then Trump claims that Putin told him he would actually accept it.
Yeah, and this is a really important detail because it just shows how complex the situation is. You have Macron pushing for a peaceful resolution with a peacekeeping force to protect the people on the ground, but at the same time, there's this deep skepticism about Putin's real intentions. It's not clear if any agreement would actually hold.
Right, it's like everyone's trying to read each other's minds while the clock is ticking.
Exactly, and that uncertainty, that tension is exactly what makes this situation so volatile and so important to understand.
So where do we go from here? What options does Macron have in this kind of precarious diplomatic dance?
Well, that's what we'll explore next. He's trying to navigate a path toward peace, but there are some big obstacles, and the stakes are incredibly high. One of the things Macron's proposed is this potential truce, followed by negotiations for a lasting peace deal. But he's made it very clear that this can't be a surrender for Ukraine. It has to include security guarantees for them.
It sounds like he's trying to thread a needle here, keeping the Ukrainians safe, but also finding a way to get Putin to the negotiating table in the first place.
Exactly, and that's where this idea of a European peacekeeping force comes in. Macron's thinking of a force of under 30,000 troops, and the idea isn't for them to engage in combat, but to secure these key areas, deter further fighting, and basically just create the space for those negotiations to happen.
And you mentioned earlier that Trump said Putin was actually open to this idea.
Yeah, which is kind of surprising considering Russia initially rejected it outright. It raises a lot of questions about Putin's motives and what he's really hoping to get out of all this.
It does make you wonder if this whole unpredictable Trump thing might actually be something Macron can use to his advantage.
It's an interesting thought, isn't it? Could Trump's deal-maker approach be the key to unlocking a solution here? It's a strange paradox, but it's definitely possible.
But wouldn't that also mean relying on someone who's already shown he's willing to shift alliances and potentially leave Europe to fend for itself?
That's the gamble Macron's taking, and it really speaks to a larger issue that this whole situation is forcing Europe to confront, their dependence on the U.S. for security.
right? This idea of Europe needing to step up and take more responsibility for its own defense.
Exactly. For decades, Europe has relied on the U.S. to guarantee their security, especially through NATO. But with Trump's America First rhetoric and his skepticism towards these multilateral alliances, well, that reliance is being seriously questioned.
So what are the practical implications of that? What does a more independent Europe actually look like?
Well, for one, it would mean bolstering their own military capabilities, coordinating defense strategies more effectively, and just being prepared to act decisively without waiting for U.S. approval. It's a huge undertaking with major implications for the global balance of power.
And potentially risky for the people in Ukraine who need help now.
Absolutely. The transition to a more independent Europe can't happen overnight. And in the meantime, Ukrainians remain incredibly vulnerable. Their fate is hanging in the balance as these larger geopolitical shifts are happening.
This brings us back to the human element. I mean, while we're talking about all this high-level diplomacy, there are real people in Ukraine whose lives are being completely upended by this conflict.
Right? It's so important to remember that these aren't just abstract political moves. They have very real consequences. We're talking about families being displaced, homes destroyed, lives lost. Every decision that's made, every delay in the negotiations adds to that human cost.
It sounds like Macron is really walking a tightrope, trying to appease Trump, reassure Europe, and ultimately bring peace to Ukraine. And all this while Putin's in the background with his real intentions unclear.
He is, and the outcome of this whole diplomatic dance, well, it'll have far-reaching implications not just for Ukraine, but for the future of Europe and the balance of power on the world stage.
You know, it's interesting in all of this, you have Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, and he's walking this incredibly difficult line. He's facing a full-blown invasion, but still seems optimistic about reaching a peaceful resolution.
Yeah, he's been remarkably determined to secure peace for Ukraine. He even suggested that the war could end this year. Ambitious for sure, but it shows his commitment to finding a solution for his people.
He's not just sitting back and waiting either. I mean, from what I've read, Zelensky's been really active engaging with other world leaders, trying to rally international support and stand up for Ukraine's sovereignty.
Right, and it's a delicate balancing act for him. He needs allies like the U.S., but he can't afford to completely alienate Russia, especially with the potential impact on everyday Ukrainians.
And speaking of needing powerful allies, we haven't even talked about the potential minerals deal between the U.S. and Ukraine, the one that Macron mentioned. It seems like that's another piece of this complex puzzle.
It is, and it's interesting because it plays into both the economic and geopolitical sides of things. Ukraine has these significant reserves of critical minerals, things that are in high demand globally. And the idea is that by forging closer economic ties with Ukraine, especially in a sector this strategically important, the U.S. would have a real reason to want to ensure Ukraine's stability.
So it's not just about aid or military support. It's about creating this economic interdependence that would make it a lot harder for the U.S. to just turn their back on Ukraine.
Exactly. That's the strategy. And it's a pretty smart move by Macron. It appeals to Trump's focus on economic interests and deal-making, but it also provides a concrete way for the U.S. to show their commitment to Ukraine.
Okay, but let's be real for a second.
Huh.
This whole situation is bigger than just the U.S., France, and Russia, right?
Yeah.
You've got China, the EU, NATO, all these other players who have a stake in this.
Oh, absolutely. China, for example, is probably watching all of this very closely. They're analyzing how the U.S. responds and trying to figure out what it means for their own ambitions.
And for the EU, it feels like a real wake-up call. They've relied on the U.S. for security for so long, but now they're having to seriously consider what a future without that might look like.
You're right. The idea of a more independent European defense force is definitely gaining traction, and this conflict is only speeding up that discussion. It could completely change the global balance of power.
And then there's NATO. With Trump questioning the value of these multinational alliances, it's hard to say what their role is in all of this.
It is, and that uncertainty adds another layer of complexity to an already very volatile situation.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the key takeaway here? What should our listeners be thinking about as they go about their day?
I think the most important thing is to recognize that we're living in a time of major global change. Old alliances are being tested, new power dynamics are emerging, and the outcome of this conflict in Ukraine will have ripple effects that we can't even fully predict yet. The world is watching, and the stakes are incredibly high, not just for Ukraine, but for the future of global stability and security.
Well said, and it really highlights how, even though this is happening on a global scale, the decisions these leaders make have very real consequences for everyday people. It's a reminder to stay informed, engage in these discussions, and to recognize that our world is deeply interconnected. Thanks for breaking it all down for us. Until next time, folks, keep diving deep.